In this module, we're going to talk about documentation. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. Now, some sections say shall document. So those are things that very specifically we must make sure that we must document it. So if the section says the auditor shall document, got to be documented. 207 says that standards contain objectives, and sure, those are objectives, but don't think any need to document it's an objective. Requirements, and we will document if it says we have to. And application and other explanatory material, which is not a requirement, so nothing in there has to be done, though they've got lots of hints sometimes. So they're not requirements, and most it says may. The auditor may. And may means the same as may not. So if something says you may do that, you can equally read it as you may not do that. Okay? So the application and other explanatory material are not requirements. They're other explanatory material. Sometimes they come awfully close to requirements because they explain the requirement. We'll talk about that. So what must we document? In 230, paragraph 8, the auditor shall prepare audit documentation that is sufficient to enable an experienced auditor having no previous connection with the audit to understand. And then it lists three things: nature, timing, and extent of auditing procedures performed. That's probably going to be automatic as we record what we do. Audit procedure results and evidence obtained. Again, probably automatic, particularly if we have an audit program. And significant matters, conclusions thereon, and significant professional judgments. Presumably significant means very, very, very important. Presumably if you have something like that, you'll remember to document it. Now, some people interpret this paragraph to mean that an experienced auditor has to understand everything you do. That's not what this paragraph says. This paragraph says there are three things that an experienced auditor needs to understand. So it doesn't say, as it's sometimes interpreted, that, well, that means that an experienced auditor has to understand everything you do and you have to document everything. So that's not what paragraph 8 says. Paragraph 9, in documenting the nature, timing, and extent, you shall record identifying characteristics. I think that'll be kind of automatic. Who did it and the date done. Got to make sure we did that. Who reviewed and the date and the extent of the review. So the reviewer, again, date and extent, and who did it. And application material A12 talks about why documenting A might help and how it might be done. And A13 says each working paper does not need evidence of review. So as we're documenting C, we don't have to do something to each working paper to document the extent of review. Though back in the days of paper files, it was often convenient for the reviewer to initial the bottom of the page just to let them themselves know that they'd reviewed that page. So 239, basically the who did and date completed for both reviewer and preparer, important that we do that. Other things that we must do, discussion of significant matters, that's kind of already required and it's probably automatic. How we discussed inconsistent matters, and again, probably automatic. Why it's okay to depart from a recommendation, that's going to be very rare, but if we're going to do that, I would assume we'd write something down. And matters arising after the report. What happens if we've issued the report and something happens that makes us wish we hadn't. Again, that's going to be rare, often particularly in a small audit. You meet the client once a year. You're not going to find anything after you issue the report until next year. Now, A6, I get a little confused by this. This is the first sentence. And I don't understand the phrase in principle. Maybe if we read it without, I understand. Compliance with the requirements of this standard, and they're talking about the documentation standard, will result in the audit documentation being sufficient and appropriate. And I get that. I don't understand in principle. Are they backing off from that a bit? But anyway, I think that says, and this is application material, comply with the requirements of this standard and you will have appropriate documentation. Next sentence. Other standards contain specific documentation requirements that are intended to clarify the application of this standard and the particular circumstances of those other standards. I get that. There are other standards that say you got to document this. So I got that. The specific documentation requirements of other standards do not limit the application of this standard. So this standard applies. You can't say, well, because I documented something in another because of another section, I don't have to apply this. Okay, I get that. It doesn't limit the application of this section. Okay. Furthermore, in the absence of a documentation requirement in any particular standard is not intended to suggest that there is no documentation that will be prepared as a result of complying with that standard. So again, a little confusing, but I think this says in general you don't have to document everything, but you probably have to document a bit more than is specifically required by a section that says you must document this, you shall document this. So as I say, it means we document anything that says documentation required, needs some more than the minimum, but it's not necessary to document everything we do. And when we read A7, it becomes, I think, clearer. Second sentence, it is neither necessary nor practicable for the auditor to document every matter considered or professional judgment made. We don't have to document everything. Further, it is unnecessary for the auditor to document separately, as in a checklist, for example, compliance with matters for which compliance is demonstrated by documents included in the audit file. Now, that does two things, actually. It says checklist is a great way to document things. And it also says, hey, remember that one thing may document compliance with another standard. So you don't have to do every single thing, and you have to think about whether or not some things that you document the requirements of other standards. Perfect. Love that. And that, by the way, is repeated in Statement of Quality Management 1 A202 and in 220 A117. So they really mean that. They've said it 3 times. Now, some of the examples in A7. It's important to understand this is just some examples. It says examples include, so there could be others. So remember that. An adequately documented audit plan shows the audit was planned. Got it. A signed engagement letter shows that the terms of the engagement were agreed. Good. A qualified audit report shows that we complied with those requirements to qualify the audit report. So the qualified report is enough to document compliance with all of those sections. Professional judgment is documented when shown as being exercised in the file. And that the engagement partner has taken responsibility for direction and supervision of the team and review of work may be shown in ways such as participating in engagement team discussions. So you don't necessarily need to specifically document each of those things, There may well be other things in the file that document it. Now, there are some people that like to say if it's not documented, it's not done. Well, that is very clearly not what the standards say. They say if we read all the above sections, it is clear that not documented, not done is not required. Now, the other problem I have with not documented, not done too, actually, is if you believe that that is true, then you also believe if it is documented, we must have done it. Whether or not we did, we've documented it, we must have done it. And the other thing that that philosophy does is it starts to highlight documentation instead of performance. So instead of actually doing audit tests and allowing the documentation to flow from that test, we do documentation instead of performance. So you've always got to remember 230A7, and if someone says, well, it's not documented, it's not done, you say, yeah, but I don't have to document it, and anyway, this part of the file here documents that I did that thing. And I will let you consider a quote from Manson Cooley, who said, documents create a paper reality we call proof. Now, almost all standards require something you would want to do anyway. If the standard wasn't there, you'd probably want to do it because it would make for a good audit. But what you have to do is find an efficient way to document it in a checklist, as a prompt, as the documentation flowing from doing the audit test, something like that. So, document what is required, document some other things, use the hints and standards, and particularly, there are all kinds of hints in the scalability comments in the application material, which will help you do less documentation, but still meet the requirements of standards. So, thanks for listening.